2, but how did you get there? Part 4. So we've already looked at the 3 passages in the Old Testament that people use to condemn same-sex relationships, all of which we've seen don't really say and apply the way that people use them today. They don't carry much weight. So now we're going to jump into the New Testament and look at the other 3 passages that people use to condemn same-sex relationships. Now, it's interesting to me that the first one, because we're going in order, that we have in the New Testament isn't until the book of Romans. Why is that interesting? Well, because it means that you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, and then the book of Romans. So it's not until 6 books into the New Testament that we begin to have or find any of these passages, which means that the entirety of the gospel, which contains the teachings of Jesus, are void of any of these prohibitions. And some people say, well, yeah, but Seth, if you look in Matthew chapter 19, Jesus teaches, about marriage and what it should look like. To which, before we get to the Romans passage, let's just look at this real quick, just for fun, and kind of address this. It's Matthew 19, and it says, if you just start with the black and white version of this verse, Jesus saying, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer 2, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Okay, so first of all, this is set within the context of a larger story, which is the Pharisees are coming after Jesus, and it is a discussion about divorce. So the discussion is about divorce. It also doesn't have anything to do, or it's a setup. It's an attempt to be a setup by the Pharisees. If you back up in that chapter, some Pharisees came to test him. That's chapter 19, verse 3. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? So then Jesus says, well, you've read the text, which of course he's referring to the story of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, Genesis 2, which we had talked about, how that would have been something that was written back as a way to maintain, social hierarchies. And so he's referring back to Torah, to Genesis 2. Then it carries on. Why then, they ask, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. So it goes on, the disciple said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and wife, it is better not to marry. Jesus replied, not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. So, for there are eunuchs who were born that way, and there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others, and there are those who choose to live like eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. So this discussion doesn't have anything to do with same-sex relationships. This is entirely the Pharisees trying to test Jesus, Jesus using the scripture that they know to push back on them, and then also adding to it to say, like, even with Moses, he goes, yeah, that was something that they used to do, but it wasn't, it's something to do, but it wasn't always this way. So Jesus never addresses this issue of same-sex relationships at all, and the part that people point to uphold the marriage between a man and woman is a reference to a passage from the Old Testament that he is pulling forward specifically to address the issue of divorce. Okay, so there's that. A bit rambly, I apologize. Now, let's turn to the passage at hand, which is Romans chapter 1. Okay, so what you have to understand when it comes to this conversation for Paul, which, by the way, the other passages, all the passages in the New Testament that people use to clobber the gay community are all written by Paul. It's written by one guy, or attributed to Paul, I should say. Okay, so let's start with the main text that people use, Romans 1, verse 26. Because of this, God gave them over to their shameful lusts. Even their women exchanged natural relations, sexual relations, for unnatural ones. In the same way, the men also abandoned natural relations with women and were inflamed with lust for one another. Men committed shameful acts with other men and received in themselves the due penalty for their error. Okay, so that's the passage. There's a lot of stuff surrounding this passage that we actually need to address. Okay, so first of all, Paul is writing, trying to reach this new church in Rome. And so it is primarily Gentile, but you do have a strong group of Jewish converts, essentially. So let's start with this. What you see in Romans 1 is Paul intentionally, there's a word for this, but it's an intentional setup in order to make a deeper point in the next chapter. So if you look at Romans 1, he's talking about, like, it's called, the subtitle in the NIV is God's wrath against sinful humanity, right? The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godless and wicked people. And then he gets into pointing out these things that would have been seen by the Jewish people towards the Roman Gentiles. They claimed to be wise, they became fools, and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man, being a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. Then God gave them over to their sinful desires, to the heart of sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. So he's stirring up the pot here for the Jewish believers. Okay, he's getting them to lean in a little bit. And then if you get to the end of chapter 1, let's see, he goes on this list about every kind of evil wickedness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. They disobey their parents. All the things, and that was, so anyways, they have no understanding, no fidelity, no love, no mercy. Although they know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death, they not only continue to do these very things, but also approve of those who practice them. Okay, so they're like, yeah, get them, Paul. Go get those evil Gentiles peoples. And then all of a sudden, you see this. Chapter 2. You, therefore, have no excuse, you who pass judgment on someone else. For at every point you judge one another, you are condemning yourself, because you pass judgment. You who pass judgment do the same things. Now we know that God's judgment against those who do such things is based in truth. So when you, a mere human being, pass judgment on them and yet do the same things, do you think you will escape God's judgment? Right? It's totally a setup. But verse 5, but because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you are storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath, when his righteous judgment will be revealed. God will repay each person according to what they have done. Right? So it's just a setup. And he's like, gotcha. Because they're going, look at how bad and evil and vile those people are. And Paul's going, yeah, but also you got problems too. Which is what he's trying to do in the larger scope of the book, is he's trying to unite and bring peace between this old Jewish convert group and this new Gentile group, right? Trying to bring harmony to these two dissenting factors within the church. That's what he's up to. So that's the premise of the whole thing. Now, let's get a bit more specific here, okay? When he talks about chapter 1, verse 26 and 7, talks about, first of all, this is the only passage where in the Bible where you have a what appears on the surface to be addressing uh, female same-sex relationships, right? Because as we saw in the other one, it was always ascribed to men. It was always what the men can't do, because the man is the active sexual agent. The woman is the passive sexual object. Women didn't have rights. It was just, you had stuff done to you, which is like a completely backwards way of understanding human sexuality as we do now. So anyways, so out of all the Clobber passages, that's the only one that you could really go, yeah, that one condemns women. But even that, it's not what it's saying. So he's talking to, again, about and to a society that is primarily Stoic in its philosophy. Stoics, it was basically aligning the self with the natural order of things, and then they had various ways to understand this natural order. In fact, Kathy Baldock, in her book, talks about the natural order. So she says, okay, everything going on countered the Stoics' natural sense of morality and harmony with nature. So the Stoics' natural nature or natural, it meant self-control, it meant social sexual norm compliance, and it meant sex acts intent on procreation. Unnatural or against nature meant lust, defiance of male dominant social sexual norms, and non-procreative sex. Okay, so she says, this is the only passage in the Bible, possibly, but not necessarily, is the only, containing commentary on lesbian sex. We need to examine it more closely. The verse describes the women as their women, or the men of wives. So anyways, this concept of Stoicism and natural versus unnatural. So the Stoics believed it was unnatural to for a man to lose control of his emotions, right? Which is why the unnatural response is lust. It was unnatural to have sex for a non-procreative purpose. In fact, it was unnatural, and I think this goes back to some of the Hebrew texts as well, that it was even unnatural for a woman to assume the position of being on top in even in a same-sex relationships, to the point that it was kind of forbidden in some of the Talmud, I believe, or some of the later rabbinical teachings. Like, even if it was a same-sex relationship, if the woman was on top, it was seen as emasculating a male, so that was also prohibited. So there's so much stuff in here. So one, if you like to have your female partner on top, that would be considered an unnatural relation because it's understood as she was taking the power from the man, and the men had the power. So there's that. You also have if anyone is having sex, even if it's in a heterosexual relationship, for the sake of pleasure, for the sake of not having a kid, that was considered unnatural. So you have all these things start to line up. You also have this idea of, when people read this passage and we say, well, that's not natural. In fact, I've had so many conversations when people are like, well, two men or two women, that's not natural. They're making a reference to this passage, but they're also making a reference to, like, they're trying to connect it to the natural order of all things, which also doesn't stand up as a great argument, because we now have, like, documented scientific evidence that something like, it's like 1,300 or 1,500 different species in, like, the natural order of creation do display same-sex behavior and characteristics. Like, so it's it's actually not unnatural to see this relationship in nature. So there's all kinds of stuff here. Again, so Paul's writing to trying to bring unity to these Gentiles and the Jews as they're beginning this new church. He's speaking to a Gentile people who would typically be more stoic in their understanding of things, and uses their language of natural versus unnatural. You also have this idea that the way and the reason this is written this way is because this is a setup. And in fact, the reality is, when it comes to Paul, Paul's sexual ethic in general would probably be, don't do it. Like, he just wasn't concerned with sex and relationships the way that we think he was concerned, because for Paul, he understood, the way he perceived things was that, like, the end was coming in his lifetime. So everything is kind of written with a sense of urgency. It's written with this understanding that those issues are essentially smaller than the other thing, all the other issues, because the end is coming. And so we need as many people to know about the gospel as we possibly can. So, like, he writes some of this stuff, but it's just not as important to him. In fact, if he would say anything, it would seem like Paul's sexual ethic is just like, hey, be single, right? Like, unless you can't hack it. Is that we have to keep in mind how Roman sexuality worked and relationships and culture is vastly different from anything that we are connected to and a part of. A man could very much be in a heterosexual relationship, but also, like, having sex with other men. Like, there was a whole lot going on behind the scenes. And this phrase, received in themselves a due penalty for their error. I think is it Kathy here that had mentioned this phrase? Here we go. Before wrapping up the examination of Romans 1, let's note that verse 27 speaks to the due penalty that befalls those who reject God. The due penalty, as understood by the Roman Gentiles, was a life devoid of self-control and filled with excess, leading to personal and social dishonor and shame. That's how they understood. And received in themselves the due penalty of their error. The due penalty was understood as a life devoid of self-control and filled with excess, leading to personal and social dishonor and shame. The unfortunate thing is that this has been used by many Christians as a threat and blame. In fact, she highlights this. Following was spoken by Jerry Falwell in 1987, when 20,000 Americans had already died of AIDS. God says that homosexuality is a perverted and reprobate lifestyle. God also says that those engaged in such homosexual acts will receive in their own persons due penalty of their error. He's bringing judgment against this wicked practice through AIDS. Yeah. Here's another one. David Barton, conservative Christian historian, in 2013 in May. Romans 1:27 is one of the reasons we'll never find a cure for AIDS, because the Bible says men committed shameful acts with other men, sexual acts received in themselves due penalty for their error. The problem is, that's not what it says. You see, when you read it in the black and white, without the context, without the larger picture, you're missing out on so much stuff, and then you end up with idiots with radio shows that are blaming AIDS. Oh, by the way, in that book, Kathy has a great section about how during the AIDS epidemic, like, actually where it all started, and how they can trace back to the origin of this crazy disease, and then how it actually didn't start with gay men or women, or with man having sex with animals, or whatever they say. and then it actually starts with heterosexual men, and then eventually gets put on the gay community. Yeah, and then how that is actually weaponized against the gay community and then becomes used in politics and religion. You should totally check that one out. Okay, so let's see. Dan McClellan in this book says many translations will render natural relations or natural intercourse, but the word is usefulness. So when it says women exchange their natural sexual relations for unnatural ones, it's saying women exchange their usefulness for unused. So because their role was simply to have babies. So if a woman was having sex with another woman, they are not going to have babies. So that is not useful. That is not natural for how they understood it, because that was how they understood the relationships to work. Okay, and here the idea seems to be their usefulness as sexually penetrable bodies. Because female same-sex intercourse can only involve a kind of counterfeit penetration, and because Paul doesn't sound very creative, the genitals are not being used for their natural or intended purposes. This actually reflects a pretty widespread prejudice in this time across the Greco-Roman world. Female same-sex intercourse was more widely condemned than male same-sex intercourse. When he talks about nature, he's really talking about social conventions that get rationalized as natural. Okay, in fact, there's in 1 Corinthians, I believe it's 11:13. Okay, so in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul, the same guy who wrote Romans, who wrote this idea about natural versus unnatural, who's again writing to the Corinthians, which is also a Greco-Roman city and church. He says this, same guy, judge for yourselves. He's talking about worship and head coverings. It is proper for a woman to pray to God with her head. Is it proper for a woman to pray to her God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. For long hair was given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So the way Paul writes this is if to say, other versions would say it this way, does not nature itself teach, would say that basically it's unnatural for a man to have long hair. Is it unnatural for a man to have long hair? I guess it depends on where you're from, what culture you're a part of, what tradition you've been raised in. If we back up a few generations in the 70s and you have all of the hippies with their long hippie hair and open-toed shoes. So you have Paul saying here in Romans, it's unnatural, it's natural. You have Paul in 1 Corinthians saying it's unnatural for a man to have long hair, right? And it's doesn't even nature itself teach that if a man wears long hair, it is dishonorable to him? Is that what nature teaches? Is that what nature teaches, that it's dishonorable to have long hair? It's unnatural, right? Well, I've never heard the people who were condemning homosexuality say much about the length of people's hair. But if we're going to be black and white people and we're going to say this is what it says, then you can't just pick and choose which ones you're going to accept and not accept. What it looks like to me is that this has little to nothing to do with how we understand human sexuality, how we understand a loving, committed same-sex relationship. This is about a specific thing at a specific place. We have taken this wildly out of context. Paul is using this as a setup to get the Jewish people to see their own, getting them to turn the mirror on themselves and to realize that nobody's perfect. We're all in the same boat. We all need Christ, and let's all work forward to help more people to do that, right? This isn't a condemnation of a loving, committed same-sex relationship as we would know today. It's just not. So you can continue to point to this and go, well, Paul says it, it's in the Bible, natural versus unnatural. Well, again, long hair, you have long hair, then you're probably out too. It's like, it's just, are you starting to see how the more, and this isn't even like the super in-depth stuff with some of the language. This is just kind of the surface level, bigger picture. So it's really hard for me to understand how we can, I get it if we're only reading this on the surface level and go, yep, that's what it says. Okay, absolutely. But if you notice too, in that Romans 1 passage, one of the condemnations here, God gave them over to their sinful desires of their heart, to sexual impurity, for the degrading of their bodies with another. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. That was the underlying issue. And so going back to the Stoicism and the natural order of things, is that the Stoic people, of the people in Rome, the Gentile people, were worshiping that which was created rather than the Creator. And so that was part of this issue, why they're being turned over. And there's a whole other discussion about what that means, being turned over to their lust. But obviously, again, when you take it all into the context and situation, it's just not saying what people have said that it's saying. It's not condemning the way that people think it's condemning. It's not, it was never meant to be weaponized against our brothers and sisters in the LGBTQ community. It just wasn't. So, okay, I feel like I've rambled on a bit, probably longer than I should have today, but let's call that good for today. That was part 4 of what we're calling How'd You Get There? Look forward to talking with you about part 5. Still got a couple more things to talk about. So we'll see you there.